Swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
In some ways, cause and effect essays seem to be the easiest ones to write thesis statements for. I mean, the two basic models are A is caused by X or Y or Z or X, Y, and Z or some variation, or A results in X or Y or Z or both or all three, right? However, a cause and effect essay, while it seems simple at first, it has some special pitfalls. And the biggest one is pitfalls of logic. And I'm going to talk about those a little bit later. But the reason logic is a really big problem is for most other essays, you never want to have logical fallacies, obviously, in any of your thinking, and especially any of your formal writing. But in the case of a cause and effect essay, if you have a logical fallacy in the cause and effect, then the entire paper fails from beginning to end. Whereas in other kinds of essays, if you have a logical fallacy in one part, it might only destroy one small part of the argument and leave the other part still standing, maybe to hold it up or to buttress it in some other way. Okay, so before we get into the kind of logical fallacies that are particularly plague cause and effect essays, I want to talk about some other problems. One is the problem of causes and effects that are too obvious. So very often we'll see papers that say, well, if you eat too much, you will gain weight. Yes, that is a cause and an effect, right? The cause is overeating. The result is, the effect is weight gain. But everyone knows this. This is so painfully obvious that immediately, as soon as even hearing about it, you're bored, right? There's nothing more to be said on the subject. And so it's far too obvious, and there's really nothing to say. And so a paper in that sense is just producing a bunch of words for nothing. So the cause or the effect should not be so obvious to the reader. The other one is one that is too insignificant, and we see some of this. This is a problem you'll often see in, sometimes in statistics where people will claim a statistical result or a statistical cause of something, and then the president's latest numbers show that his approval rating has dropped by 2%. Well, when the margin for error of a poll is 3%, 2% means no change. It is literally no change at all. By using something statistically insignificant, we also see this in things that are non-statistical, where someone will say, this causes this other thing, or this is caused by this other thing. And it's not that that thing maybe is not caused or affected by whatever it is we're talking about, but that the degree of it is not worth talking about. It's not obvious, but it's also not significant enough to be worthwhile. Another very common problem are causes and effects that are oversimplified. They imagine that if you do X, only this one effect will happen, or only this one significant effect will happen, or that X is caused by only one of two things, right? When in fact there are a whole myriad things that are involved in this. Now that doesn't mean you can't talk about how X causes Y, while knowing that X is part of a constellation of things that might cause it, or that Y is part of a constellation of possible effects of X. But regardless, you need to be aware of that, and it's a great danger for student essays to oversimplify things so that they act like X is the only cause of Y, or Y is the only effect of X. Even if they don't use the word only, often they will act this way. And And in a sense, you can see the impulse to do that because you're trying to strengthen your argument as much as possible, right? Stronger argument, better paper. Except in this case, very often you end up ultimately weakening your paper because you made your argument too simplified. Another danger are what we call counterfactuals. Counterfactuals. What are counterfactuals? Well, counterfactuals are things which are not the case, but we imagine that if they were, okay? So it's very often, if such and such had happened, this other thing might have happened, right? For example, one might say, if my grandmother were still alive today, she would never tolerate this behavior. Okay, maybe, but maybe not. We can't know because my grandmother is not alive today. It's counterfactual. A counterfactual isn't necessarily true or untrue. It's simply dealing with a situation that doesn't exist, is neither provable nor unprovable. So avoid any kind of cause and effect paper that says that if this situation happens or doesn't happen, this other situation would happen, but we have no examples of it or we have no real evidence for it. That's a counterfactual, and that's a very dangerous thing to write about because it's almost impossible to prove. The student feels confident because they say, well, you can't show it's not. Well, yeah, but it's not the reader's responsibility to show that you were wrong. It's your responsibility to show that you were right. Right? So just because it's non-disprovable, non-falsifiable doesn't mean that you've proven your point. And I want to talk about two particular logical errors that are really a problem. One is confusing correlation with causation. And sounds complicated, but what it basically means is you confuse two things that are connected to one another with things that assuming that one thing causes the other thing. So, for example, one reason it's very difficult to make a claim that taking vitamin supplements improves your health is not because it's necessarily untrue. It may be true, it may be false. It's not really clear. The problem is that the correlation and causation are really close to one another. What do we mean by that is people who take vitamin supplements regularly are probably very concerned about their health. And so when you see people who take vitamin supplements regularly, you start to see people who exercise regularly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Or to take a less controversial example, people who drink diet sodas tend to be heavier than people who do not drink diet sodas. And that correlation has caused some people to say, well, what this means is that drinking diet sodas will make you fat. Well, that's confusing correlation with causation because it's possible. Some people have argued that it's true and tried to find a way to show the causation. But in fact, all we really see is a correlation because it's also just as logical and perhaps even more so to say, if people are overweight already, they are more likely to drink diet sodas because they're concerned about their weight. Whereas people who are very thin are probably not so concerned about their weight and thus drinking diet sodas. Okay. So in some cases, the correlation causation isn't clear. And if it isn't clear, you cannot just assert it's caused by that thing. And the last logical fallacy I want to warn you against in these kinds of papers is what's called the Posthoc Fallacy, which is, this thing happened after that thing. And we see this kind of thing all the time. This is a favorite of sports fans, right? Where a sports fan will, be wearing a certain shirt when their team does really well. And then they get this superstition that they have to wear that shirt to support their team. If they wore their shirt and then afterward their team did well, therefore their wearing of that shirt somehow caused their team to do better. Now, if if you ask any sports fan logically, reasonably, come on, you don't really think that your shirt gave this team that has thousands and thousands of fans good luck. They're going to say, no, I don't believe in that. But they might still wear the shirt anyway, because somewhere in the back of their mind, they're still influenced by the post-hoc fallacy. But if I don't wear it, a bad thing will happen. Now, like I said, it isn't like logical fallacies are ever good. It's also not like these are the only logical fallacies. I've got, there are all sorts of lists of logical fallacies that you can fall into. In fact, there's one fallacy that's the fallacy of fallacies, right? Which is to say, just because something you've arrived at a conclusion by logical fallacy doesn't mean the conclusion's false. It just meant your way to get there was false. Demonstrating that a logical fallacy got you there doesn't necessarily prove the thing was false. So there are all sorts of logical fallacies, but cause and effect papers have a couple that they are particularly prone to, and you should be really careful about.